Hello, in this video I will be ranking all the Fox X-Men films. I'm going to be including the two Deadpool films on this list, but I'm not going to be including New Mutants, however. So coming in at last place, let's see, X-Men, X2, X3, Origins Wolverine, The Wolverine, Logan, First Class, Days of Future Past, Apocalypse, Dark Phoenix, 10. Looks like there's 10. Looks like there's 10 films that'll be on this list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. No, actually, it looks like 12. Yeah, so coming in last place at number 12, we have X-Men Origins Wolverine. This film is really bad. In fact, it's hard for me to even say something that I like about this film, other than the fact that the Sabretooth in this film is better than the Sabretooth we saw in the first X-Men film. There are many problems with this film. For one, we see a little bit of Wolverine and Sabretooth fighting all these major wars, but you want to just see more of that. Unfortunately, in X-Men Origins Wolverine, you only see that for 10 minutes. On top of that, the way that Deadpool is treated in this film is really bad. The visual effects are bad. I mean, they especially during the bathroom scene and that scene where Wolverine causes a helicopter to explode and then walks away. Ooh, they look very over the top, straight out of a cartoon. Also, there's not a lot of characters that are done well in this film. Plus, most of the continuity here does not match the other X-Men films. And the fact that Fox never did an Origins film, a film called X-Men Origins something after X-Men Origins Wolverine, says a lot. Then coming in at number 11, we have X-Free X-Men United, a really disappointing end to the original X-Men film trilogy. The problem with X-Free is that there's too much going on here. The film tries to do the Magneto Brotherhood of Mutants storyline along with the Cure storyline and the Dark Phoenix, one of the most famous X-Men stories, all in one film. That's just too much for one film. Plus, the way that Cyclops is treated is just horrible. The fact that Cyclops is killed off with no fanfare in a completely unceremonious way. He's just killed off screen, and then no one cares in the slightest after the fact. His character is not honored in any way. The film is just like, Cyclops, screw him. Let's just get him out of here. Let's just kill him off screen and then not have anyone mourn him whatsoever or remember him, even. Now we're just gonna move on, sweep his character under the rug. And, well, those right there are the major issues with this film. It really was a big letdown after the first two X-Men films, and especially after X2 X-Men United, which was just so good. And then coming in at number 10, we have, let's see, we have X-Men Apocalypse. Now, I don't think this is a bad film like X-Free X-Men United or X-Men Origins Wolverine, but overall, this film feels rather forgettable and mediocre. To me, it comes off as another generic superhero film that just plays everything by the books. It doesn't do much to stand out. Therefore, this film is one that I have a hard time remembering much about. Apocalypse is not done well in this film. He's very generic, and the plot here is another standard by the books comic book movie plot where the villain wants to take over the world and the heroes have to stop him. Plus, you have a forced Wolverine cameo in this film. And the fact that this film came after X-Men First Class and X-Men Days of Future Past is really disappointing because I was a big fan of both of those films. But this film was not very good. And then coming in at number 9, we have X-Men Dark Phoenix. The fact that Fox tried to do the Dark Phoenix storyline again for the second time and failed yet again is pretty embarrassing. Why is it that I'm a big fan of this film? Well, for one, the villains here are really not good whatsoever. Also, I think Charles Xavier acts really out of character, and on top of that, Jean Grey is not particularly interesting in this film. So overall, Dark Phoenix is just mediocre to me. And then coming in at number 8, we have the first X-Men film. Now, I know that this is an important film for the comic book genre. X-Men was a big deal back when it came out in 2000 because at the time there were not a lot of comic book movies coming out, unlike today where there are a lot of comic book movies coming out. This film came out after Blade, and it really helped to kickstart the modern day comic book movie boom, where there are a lot of comic book films coming out. Yeah, Spider-Man really got the ball rolling because that was a mega blockbuster, but there's still no denying that X-Men played a big part in that. Blade, X-Men, and Spider-Man all played a big part in bringing comic book movies back. Also, this is the film that started it all for the X-Men franchise. It does do a great job of laying the foundation that the other movies build on top of. It does a good job of introducing you to the characters and this world. In particular, Rogue, Magneto, Xavier, and Wolverine are done really well. But unfortunately, some of the other characters are not done particularly well. Scott is Summers, aka Cyclops, is not particularly likable in this film, nor is he developed very much. Storm is rather generic in this film. Her heavy accent is pretty distracting, and that line where she goes, "What happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else." Is really not good. Though admittedly there are some good moments of humor in this film, but while X-Men is an important film for the comic book genre, well, it definitely deserves credit for laying the foundation for the X-Men franchise. I don't think the film has necessarily aged the best. I think that the plot for this film doesn't hold up very well. It's not that good. Also, Magneto is a great villain, but the other mutants that work with Magneto in this film don't stand out very much. I mean, they're good enough, but they don't do that much in this film. Also, when you go back and watch the first X-Men film now, it does feel dated. It feels like a product of its time. One of the main reasons for that is not only does this film have a more serious tone, but for the most part, our characters are wearing black leather, and this film does not embrace the absurdity that comes from comic these comic book characters. So overall, I don't dislike X-Men or think it's mediocre. I think it's a good film that's definitely important to the genre and to this franchise, but I don't think the film has necessarily held up that well over the passage of time. Or put another way, I think in certain ways the film does feel dated. But moving on now to number 7, we have we have Deadpool. Now, don't get me wrong. I think Ryan Reynolds does a fantastic job in this film. In a lot of ways, he carries this film. He is having so much fun with this role. It honestly is great that this film even came out in the first place after X-Men Origins Wolverine. It is very great and refreshing to actually get a comic book accurate version of Deadpool on screen. The fact that an R-rated comic book film like Deadpool was such a success should not be forgotten. That is great. Also, there are some really funny moments in this film. In particular, the meta moments in Deadpool are what really pop, really stand out. Those are really good. But the plot of this film, um, the plot of this film, Wade Wilson's revenge plotline, does feel rather generic to me. It does feel by the books. So overall, in certain ways, I do think that with this film they played it safe, even though there are some really funny moments in this film, and in a lot of ways, this film is carried by Ryan Reynolds' fantastic performance. Also, when it comes to the romance between Vanessa and Deadpool, overall, I think it's done well, but it also does, again, feel generic to me. But coming in at number 6, we have the we have the Wolverine, which overall I actually really like. I like the fact that the Wolverine feels different from other X-Men films, not just because it's a standalone Wolverine film that doesn't feature a lot of other X-Men, but also because of the fact that this film takes place pretty much entirely in Japan, which is a different setting. Also, this film has a more serious tone for the most part compared to other X-Men films. Also, Wolverine ends up losing his powers for a good amount of the film, making him more vulnerable than usual. But, however, the biggest problem with this film is that when you get to the third act, it turns into a generic comic book film because you have a over the top third act where heroes facing off against a villain who's in a big mech suit, and therefore the film not only suddenly feels a lot more generic, but the film switches tone. Because I mentioned earlier that for the most part, this is a more serious film. That's a character study of Logan. That's why I think this film does well. But then once you get to the third act, it suddenly turns into a much more goofy and over the top film. I don't think that works. But overall, I do really like the Wolverine still. But coming in at number 5, we have Deadpool 2, which I felt was an improvement over the first film. I'd say this one is more meta than the first film is. I like the fact that Cable is in this film. I like the relationship between Russell and Wade Wilson. I like the fact that Wade has to figure out in this film how to carry on without Vanessa, but I do feel like there's a bit too much going on in this film. It feels like the people who made Deadpool 2 didn't know when to say this is enough for one film. But I did really like the character Domino as well as like all the other members of X Force that we see in this film, though admittedly they do not have a huge amount of screen time. I also think it's really powerful that in the third act, Deadpool chooses to take a bullet in order to save Russell. Considering that Deadpool is certainly not a traditional black and white hero, and it's really powerful to see him actually act selflessly because that's not something that happens very often for Deadpool. And then coming in at number 4, we have X-Men First Class, which I think is a really good film. I don't think it's a great film, but I really like how First Class explores the relationship between Xavier and Magneto. I like how we're seeing younger versions of characters that we've seen before in other X-Men films. I think pretty much all the characters are good here. I think the villain is really good. I don't know if I have any. Yeah, I don't have any big problems with First Class, but I just don't think it's as good as the top 3, which will be X-Men 2, X-Men United, X-Men Days of Future Past, and Logan. Coming in number 3, we have X2 X-Men United. I think this is a great sequel to the first X-Men film because it builds on top of the foundation laid by the first film. It explores the characters more, has some great action scenes, especially the Nightcrawler scene right at the beginning of the film. The story here is done really well. I think William Stryker is a good villain. Jean Grey's sacrifice in the third act of this film is really powerful. But coming in at number 2, we have X-Men Days of Future Past, which I'm a really big fan of because I thought this film did a great job of cleaning up the cleaning up the continuity of the X-Men films, which had become really, really messy. Unfortunately, after X-Men Days of Future Past came out, future films did not work to keep the continuity intact. Over time, the continuity of these films definitely became worse and worse to the point where if you tried to actually make sense of it, it feels like your head would explode because there's so many inconsistencies. But I like how this film did at least really try to clean up the continuity. Also, I think the action scenes here are really good. Several of the characters like Xavier, Magneto, Mystique, Wolverine are done really well. Overall, I do think that one of the big problems of the Fox X-Men films is that they focus on a select few characters rather than developing a lot of the different X-Men. But I'm a big fan of X-Men Days of Future Past. The Quicksilver scenes are really good. The way the film ends is really good with the promise of what is to come in the future, with the knowledge that everything is going to turn out really well. Yeah, when future films came out, they basically said that no, this doesn't end up being the case. But just looking at the ending of Days of Future Past, it's really, really good. But coming in at number 1 is Logan. The big reason why Logan is my favorite out of all the X-Men films is that I think this is a really special film in the comic book genre, similar to Joker, because Logan does not feel like a superhero film. It doesn't even feel like a comic book film. It feels much more like a Western. James Mangold really knocked it out of the park with this film. I talked earlier about The Wolverine and how it was really good until the third act, but Logan is great all the way through. The way that it closes out Xavier and Logan's arcs is really, really good. The way the film handles the character of Charles Xavier is really sad and frankly heartbreaking. The new char- the new character of the new character played by Daphne Keane is really, really good. Daphne Keane did a great job of playing Laura, especially I don't. No, I don't think that's her. I don't think her name's Laura, but the character does not speak until about the third act of the film, and yet Daphne Keane does such a great job of communicating a lot without much. She manages to communicate a lot just through body language, facial expression. I was really impressed with how good she was in this film. Also, the main theme here is really good. There are great action scenes in this film. I like the fact that James Mangold was able to make this a hard R film that's pretty violent and has quite a good amount of language. Also, I like the fact that we don't see very many of the X-Men in this film. We don't even see Xavier's school at all. It really helps this film to stand out from the other X-Men films. So I was really, really impressed by this film. And this is one that really, really stands out in the comic book genre. Um, uh, let me see here. What's the name? What's the name of Daphne Keene's character? I don't know. Oh yeah, she plays X-23 in this film. Also, I'd say that basically all the other characters are really good. I will say the villains in this film are not great, but they work for the type of film that this is. But that will wrap things up for this ranking. So overall the Fox X-Men films were always pretty inconsistent, both in terms of their quality and also in terms of continuity. But there's definitely been some real gems among the Fox X-Men films, no doubt about that. And I really hope that Disney does a good job now that they have the film rights to the X-Men. We'll see when they actually come into the MCU. But that'll wrap things up.